Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West. Happy Tolkien Reading Day to you all. In celebration of this most holy of days for all Tolkien fans, we have decided to look into another tale of friendship and love, though this tale will have slightly darker origins.
This will be an examination of all the tales that involve dragon greed, that marring of the spirit of all those who attempted to lay claim to the horrors of the divers dragons that fill up the legendarium in order to better appreciate Thorin's accomplishment when he overcame this curse in order to come to the rescue of Laketown and Bilbo, and how it was his friendship with Bilbo that redeemed him.
The Hobbit is often taken as a standalone book, but if you include the stories in the appendix section and the tales from the Silmarillion, and a better idea of just what an amazing accomplishment Thorin's overcoming of the dragon greed truly was. But first, let's get into examining what dragon greed is.
Dragon greed appears to be when a part of the dragon's most wicked thoughts and desires have seeped into their hoard after they have rested upon it for a time. In the case of Glaurung, this was but a few years. In the case of Scatha and Smaug, centuries. This greed seems to push those who lay claim to their hoards to comport themselves in a manner akin to the dragons themselves.
With that in mind, let's look at the example in the Silmarillion. When Nargothrond falls, you've got Glaurung who proceeds to take over the main fortress. He rests for a time upon a mountain of gold, which he infects with his greed, before venturing off to go try to kill Turin Turambar, only to die at Turin's hands. Mim finds the treasure is immediately drawn to the Nauglamir, which becomes likely very, very infected by this dragon greed. This leads to Hurin, when he grabs it and kills Mim, taking it away and chucking it at the feet of Eruthingol, who quickly succumbs to dragon greed, deciding that, yay, mine, and has dwarves that are working below his fortress fuse it with a Silmaril, which the dragon greed that's infected the Nauglamir, combined with the curse of the Silmaril, proceed to basically make a mess of everything, as the dwarves then proceed to kill Thingol in the dungeons below his fortress of Menegroth. So yeah, dragon greed won this round. The next real big story is not quite as big as this early disaster that leads to war between elves and dwarves. The next story is that of Fram. Fram is son of Frumgar, according to the appendix of Lord of the Rings, and was Lord of the Eotheod. And Fram is noteworthy because he's the only dragon slayer in the history of the Rohirrim. The dragon he slew was known as Scatha the Longworm. He's suspected of being another victim of dragon greed due to just how he reacts when the dwarves ask for a cut of the treasure of Scatha the Longworm, as there was undoubtedly a great mountain of treasure there too. Fram sends them the teeth as a bit of a death threat to tell them, don't push me, and you're welcome to try and take it. So in response, the dwarves kill Fram, which causes the Rohirrim to mistrust dwarves ever after until the tale of Lord of the Rings. And it's very likely that he did succumb to some dragon greed. This caused him to kind of forget his better judgment, as there was probably dwarf treasures in that mountain where Scatha was slain. So that's 2 out of the way, and dragon greed's won 2 rounds here. We now come to the tale of Thorin and Bilbo. We're not going to recount the whole main thrust of the story here will involve the treasure of Smaug. Smaug had claimed the treasure in the Lonely Mountain for centuries, rested upon the gold there, likely trying to imitate Jeff Bezos in his own special way. As Bezos probably has his own mountain of gold, he wraps himself in dragonic form all around. That said, Smaug would infect a great deal of the treasure with his greedy essence, with this spiritual greed that would infect most of those who pick up the treasures that he had infected, such as, and most notably, the Arkenstone, which was what Thorin desired the most in all the world, as it was the primary treasure of his forefathers. Thorin would, of course, find that finding it was easier said than done, only for Bard to reveal that he had it, because Bilbo slipped away in the night using the One Ring to turn invisible to go to the enemy camp and give the Arkenstone so that there could be negotiations rather than war between the two sides. Bilbo returned to the dwarves, though, because he didn't want to put Bombur in trouble. Bombur being Bilbo's other great bro amongst the company of Thorin. You've got Thorin, though, trapped by his dragon greed, Greed, who would be filled with the desire to throw Bilbo overboard, so to speak, from the mountain, yelling at him,
You miserable hobbit. You undersized burglar.
This did not, anyone who knows the story knows that Gandalf interceded, as that was his. Thorin would, in the end, reject Bilbo and break off their friendship. Trapped by his greed and his hunger for the Arkenstone, when the time came, the orcs came to attack the region of the Dale, Thorin would pull through, charge out there, and would ultimately fight to his last breath. Bilbo and Thorin would be reunited when Thorin's on his deathbed, with Thorin saying the rather heartbreaking and heartwarming line,
If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world.
We gotta appreciate the fact that dwarves are far more susceptible to dragon greed than any other people. Thorin, though, ultimately did not succumb completely to the greed of Smaug. He overcame it. He reconnected with Bilbo on his deathbed. It was his bond and loyalty towards Bilbo, who had risked life and limb countless times over the course of the journey, that helped restore Thorin to honor and dignity. In those last moments, he was truly the king he ought to have been, and that he was meant to be, and that his forefathers probably would have preferred him to be. This story of Thorin being willing to die for Bilbo, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. One can compare it to the death of Patroclus from the Iliad, wherein Patroclus was the cousin and best friend of Achilles and donned the armor of the great Greek warrior to try to shake his cousin out of laziness and greed, as Achilles didn't want to go out and fight the Trojans. Patroclus died, but he ultimately pulled Achilles out of his funk and got him to start fighting again. One can kind of see the bond as being akin to something like that. It's a bond where it bettered both, and that's no easy thing to accomplish, especially when you have Thorin, who's all but possessed. We ought to look at it. Thorin is possessed by all but the spirit of Smaug, as there's something of Smaug in this dragon greed, just as there was something of Glaurung that possessed Thingol and the dwarves that slew him, and something of perhaps Scatha that possessed Fram. It's this context that we ought to look at the dragon greed, that they are possessing the men who claim their treasures. They're distorting the personalities of these men into their own. It's interesting that Tolkien wrestles with the idea of claiming the treasure of another ends up marring your own soul and spirit in the process. But it's only by releasing the treasure, letting it go, that you truly reclaim yourself. But Thorin chooses not just to restore himself to himself, he chooses to give his life up for a friend, and there's nothing more beautiful than that. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to smash that like and subscribe button, like your Éowyn hewing down the Witch King of Angmar in the name of her beloved uncle/surrogate father, Theoden.